They never told you this, but women, according to Schopenhauer, hold a power so subtle, so insidious, that it bends the will of men without ever raising a hand. Emotional manipulation is not merely a tool. They have mastered it as an instinctual art, honed through centuries of biological necessity and social constraint. But ask yourself, why is it that men, often praised for rationality, so easily crumble under the weight of emotional persuasion? Could it be that logic, that proud fortress of the masculine psyche, is but a fragile facade when confronted with the primordial strategies of emotional seduction? Schopenhauer did not romanticize this dynamic. He saw it for what it is, a game of survival, cloaked in affection but driven by the relentless will to life. Woman, for him, was not the ethereal muse of idealist poetry, but the cunning architect of desire, expertly maneuvering the emotional landscape to secure her existential aims. And yet, you've been conditioned to deny this truth, haven't you? Conditioned to see women as passive recipients of male affection, rather than as sovereign players, scripting emotional dramas with terrifying precision. Why is this truth so intolerable? Because it unmasks not just women, but you, your susceptibility, your unconscious participation in the very manipulations you claim to despise. As Schopenhauer wrote, "The woman is by nature meant to obey, but also to deceive." A statement not of hatred, but of brutal recognition. The question is, now that you see the mask slipping, will you dare to keep watching? Or will you, like so many, retreat into comforting illusions? The choice is already being made for you. You were led to believe that manipulation is learned, but what if it is innate? What if the very architecture of the female psyche has, over millennia, evolved to perfect emotional influence as a biological imperative? Schopenhauer saw through the sentimental haze that blinds modern sensibilities. For him, woman's existence is inextricably tied to the continuation of the species, to the raw and indifferent will to life, a force that operates beneath consciousness, beneath morality, beneath everything you were taught to revere. Ask yourself, how could nature entrust something so vital, reproduction, to mere chance? It couldn't. So it armed women with the most effective weapon of all, the capacity to shape male behavior not through brute force, but through the far more effective mechanisms of desire, guilt, affection, and withdrawal. Do you see it now? Emotional manipulation is not malice, it is strategy. It is nature's cold logic disguised as warmth, love, and vulnerability. You've seen this in your own life, haven't you? The silent punishments, the calculated tears, the carefully timed affections that shift your decisions without you even realizing it. And yet you dare call yourself free. Schopenhauer would scoff at your delusion. Freedom is but a flattering word, masking the chains of biological programming. And those chains, in this case, are woven through the subtle gestures and unspoken cues of emotional manipulation. Still, you cling to the myth of equal footing in relationships, as if nature ever cared for your moral fantasies. But if nature does not care, why should you? The ground beneath your certainties is already crumbling. You've been told since childhood that women are the moral compass of society, the nurturing force, the epitome of virtue. But stop and ask yourself, who benefits from this myth? Schopenhauer stripped away this comforting illusion with ruthless clarity. For him, the portrayal of woman as inherently virtuous is not a reflection of truth, but a strategic facade, one that enables emotional influence to operate unchecked, under the guise of innocence. Consider this. Would manipulation be effective if it appeared overtly sinister? Of course not. Its potency lies precisely in its camouflage, the sweet words, the soft eyes, the vulnerability that disarms your rational defenses. And while you're seduced by the appearance of virtue, the machinery of influence grinds on, altering your behavior in ways you barely notice. But why is this so hard to admit? Perhaps because, to acknowledge it, you must confront a darker reality, that your desires, your chivalry, your very sense of protectiveness have been co-opted. Schopenhauer understood this deeply. He saw that man's idealization of woman is less about who she truly is and more about what he needs her to be, a vessel for his fantasies of goodness, of purity, of salvation. And so the cult of female virtue persists, shielding manipulative behaviors from scrutiny while casting male resistance as cruelty, or worse, as fear of the feminine. But what if fear is precisely what you should feel? What if behind every act of seeming fragility, there is a strategic mind, centuries in the making, ensuring survival through mastery of emotional control? The mask of virtue is cracking. Can you hear it, or will you keep pretending it isn't there? You thought love was unconditional, didn't you? That affection was freely given, a spontaneous expression of feeling. But what if I told you that, more often than not, it is calculated, leveraged, withheld, and dispensed with precision? Schopenhauer warned us, human interactions are rarely guided by conscious reason, but by the blind, unrelenting will. And in the case of emotional manipulation, this will manifests in one of its most refined forms, leverage. Think about it. How often have you altered your actions, your words, your very beliefs to avoid her disapproval? How many times have you compromised, appeased, or sacrificed? Not out of love, but out of fear. Fear of losing her affection, her validation, her presence. This is not a flaw unique to you. It is a universal pattern, one that Schopenhauer saw as intrinsic to the male-female dynamic. Woman, by virtue of her deeper connection to the necessities of survival and reproduction, has perfected the use of emotional leverage long before you were even aware such a game was being played. But do you really think she's consciously plotting? No. That's what makes it so effective. It is instinctive, embodied, a reflex honed through the silent wisdom of evolution. The result? You are bound by invisible chains, subtle yet unbreakable. Chains forged not in iron, but in glances, in silences, in words that echo long after they've been spoken. And yet, you comfort yourself with the lie of autonomy. But tell me, when was the last time you made a decision in a relationship that was truly yours, untainted by the fear of her emotional reprisal? You struggle to answer because the question itself exposes the terrifying possibility that you may never have been free. The chains tighten with every breath you take. You've been led to believe that the manipulator is always aware, always malicious. But what if that's not true? What if the most effective manipulators are those who sincerely believe themselves to be victims? Schopenhauer understood this paradox long before modern psychology gave it a name. In his view, the human will is indifferent to truth or justice. It seeks only to perpetuate itself. And so, emotional manipulation often wears the mask of suffering, not to deceive consciously, but because suffering itself is a form of power. Ask yourself, how often has her pain, real or feigned, become the lever that shifts your decisions? How many times have her tears, her silences, her whispered confessions of vulnerability forced you into concessions you otherwise would not have made? You believed you were protecting her, but perhaps you were protecting yourself from the unbearable discomfort of being seen as cruel. This is the genius of the victim role. It transforms the manipulator into the protected, the defended, the unquestionable. And you, eager to be her savior, walk straight into the trap with your eyes wide shut. Schopenhauer would argue that this is not a moral failing, but a structural one. The will drives both the manipulator and the manipulated, entwining them in a dance where neither fully understands their role, yet both are compelled to play it. But you must ask, who benefits? Who gains ground, influence, control, under the pretext of weakness? To see this dynamic is to confront a terrifying truth, that even the purest expressions of compassion can be harnessed as tools of domination. You've been played, and you still thank her for the opportunity. The performance continues, but now you know it is a performance. Will you stay in your seat, or will you stand and walk away? You were taught that guilt is a sign of conscience, of moral awareness. But what if it's also the most effective weapon in the arsenal of emotional manipulation? Not through overt accusations, but through subtle insinuations, through quiet disappointments, through the crushing weight of, "You should have known." Schopenhauer saw guilt not as a noble emotion, but as a psychological trap, ensnaring individuals in cycles of self-recrimination that serve the interests of others. The will does not care for fairness, it only cares for influence. And what better way to influence than to make you believe that your suffering is deserved? How often have you apologized for actions you didn't understand, for failures you weren't aware of committing? How many times has her silence, her wounded glance, her passive withdrawal left you scrambling to make amends, to fix a problem you never even consciously created, and yet you believed it was your fault? You assumed the position of the perpetrator while she, silent, aggrieved, assumed the role of moral superior. This is not accidental. It is the perfect mechanism of control, to make you responsible not just for your actions, but for her feelings, her moods, her disappointments. Schopenhauer recognized this as a fundamental feature of human relationships, this subtle coercion masked as emotional sensitivity. And nowhere is it more potent than within the dynamics between men and women, where centuries of cultural programming have primed you to accept guilt as the natural consequence of her unhappiness. But you must ask yourself, is your guilt a reflection of genuine wrongdoing, or is it a conditioned response to an unspoken strategy? The answer may unsettle you, because if your guilt is not yours, then neither are your choices. You are being steered, manipulated by forces you barely comprehend. And yet, the steering wheel was never in your hands. You've convinced yourself that love is a fair exchange, affection given, affection received, sacrifice offered, sacrifice returned. But Schopenhauer would laugh at such naive optimism. For him, human relationships are not governed by fairness but by asymmetry, by the relentless hidden calculations of the will. Ask yourself, how many of your sacrifices have truly been reciprocated? How often has your loyalty been met with the same intensity, your efforts with the same devotion? You want to believe that emotional exchanges are symmetrical, that when you give, she will give, that when you commit, she will too. But what if this belief is a fiction carefully maintained to keep you invested, while the real economy of the relationship tilts inexorably in her favor? Schopenhauer saw this clearly. Woman, he argued, is not concerned with abstract notions of fairness, but with securing her needs, her position, her survival. Emotional manipulation operates precisely through the promise of reciprocity, a promise that is rarely, if ever, fulfilled in equal measure, and yet you persist. You continue to give more, to compromise further, hoping that your devotion will unlock a mythical state of mutual affection. But this is the very illusion that keeps you ensnared. The asymmetry is not an accident, it is structural. She holds the power of selective affection, the ability to regulate your emotional access, to bestow or withhold intimacy based on your compliance. You mistake these fluctuations as natural rhythms of love, when in truth, they are levers of control. But can you admit this to yourself? Or will you continue to believe in the myth of reciprocity, clinging to the hope that one day she will finally give back what you've so freely offered? The house always wins. And you are still placing your bets. You believe fragility is weakness, that when she cries, when she falters, when she collapses into your arms, it is a sign of helplessness. But what if I told you that this very display of fragility is among the most calculated and effective tools of emotional manipulation? Schopenhauer understood that human interactions are rarely what they appear to be. He saw that beneath every gesture of apparent vulnerability often lies a strategic performance, a means to evoke specific responses in others: sympathy, protection, compliance. Ask yourself, how many times has her display of weakness compelled you to soften your stance, to concede, to surrender your position in the name of care? How often has her fragility disarmed your reason, making you act against your own interests? And yet, you never questioned it. You never considered that fragility could be a mask, a performance perfected through centuries of social conditioning. For what is more disarming to the masculine psyche than the sight of a woman in distress? Schopenhauer saw a woman's fragility, not as a defect, but as a functional adaptation, a method of influencing the stronger through the evocation of his protective instincts. The will, ever indifferent to morality, exploits every available avenue to achieve its aims. And what is more effective than turning weakness into strength? You who pride yourself on your strength have been made obedient not through force, but through the carefully orchestrated performance of fragility. But now that you see the script, will you still play your role? Or will you walk off the stage, leaving her performance unanswered? The curtains have not yet fallen. You've been told that women are more emotionally honest, more in touch with their feelings, more willing to express their inner worlds. But Schopenhauer would smirk at such a naive assumption. For him, what appears as emotional honesty is often nothing more than refined technique, an evolved capacity for using emotional displays as instruments of influence. Ask yourself, how much of what she shares is genuine revelation, and how much is curated for effect? Do you really believe that every tear, every confession, every trembling admission is pure, unfiltered truth? Or is it possible, terrifyingly possible, that much of what you interpret as honesty is, in fact, strategic disclosure? Carefully, selected to elicit specific reactions from you? Schopenhauer understood that human beings, driven by the will, are rarely transparent, even to themselves. What masquerades as self-expression often conceals deeper motives, motives aimed at securing advantage, extracting resources, or ensuring commitment. And nowhere is this dynamic more pervasive than in the emotional exchanges between men and women. She may tell you her secrets, share her wounds, reveal her vulnerabilities, but always, always with an eye toward how you will respond. You think you are privileged to know her inner world. But what if the version she presents is simply the one most likely to bind you to her? Is that honesty, or is that manipulation? You may protest, recoil at such cynicism, but Schopenhauer offers no comfort here. He would remind you that human relationships are governed not by ideals, but by necessities, the primal, relentless needs of the will cloaked in the language of love and intimacy. So now you must confront the possibility that what you cherish as authenticity may be nothing more than performance. Can you bear that knowledge, or will you retreat, once again, into the safety of illusion? The mirror is right in front of you. You've made it this far, and now the final, most unsettling truth stands before you. Emotional manipulation is not an aberration. It is the structure. It is not the exception, but the rule. Schopenhauer would offer you no solace here. For him, human life is not a quest for happiness, but a relentless struggle, a theater of the will in which manipulation, suffering, and illusion are inevitable. But within this brutal diagnosis lies a hidden possibility, a form of liberation, not the naive freedom of the romantic, still hoping for pure love untouched by strategy, but the dark freedom of disillusionment. Ask yourself, what would your relationships look like if you stripped away the illusions? If you stopped expecting fairness, stopped believing in untainted affection, stopped imagining that emotional exchanges are anything but contests of influence masked by tenderness. You fear this clarity because it feels cold, inhuman, nihilistic. But Schopenhauer would argue that it is only through such clarity that you can begin to act freely, not as a pawn of the will, not as a victim of manipulation, but as a sovereign observer of the game. To see manipulation for what it is does not make you bitter. It makes you awake. And with awakening comes power, the power to set boundaries, to resist unconscious coercion, to choose engagement not out of compulsion, but out of deliberate will. But make no mistake, this is a lonely path. Few are willing to renounce the comforting myths of love, reciprocity, and emotional purity. Most would rather remain asleep, ensnared by the beautiful performances that structure their lives. The question now is not about her, or about women, or even about Schopenhauer's grim philosophy. The question is about you. Will you awaken? Will you step out of the shadows of manipulation and into the cold, exhilarating light of truth? Or will you, like most, turn away, seeking once again the fragile comfort of illusion? The choice is yours, and the curtain has finally fallen.